History books like to pretend that medieval warfare was all about noble knights, shining armor, and heroic last stands. The truth is far more entertaining and far more stupid. At its core, medieval siegecraft was basically humanity discovering increasingly creative ways to throw heavy objects at other humans who did not want heavy objects thrown at them. And nowhere is this more gloriously obvious than in the tale of three legendary weapons. The Crusader trebuchets at Nicaea, Rome's famously self-destructive Onager, and the great counterweight war machines that would one day pulverize castles from Acre to Stirling. If there was ever a moment during the First Crusade when the Crusaders might have paused and asked themselves whether God truly favored their enterprise, it was the siege of Nicaea in May-June 1097. The city, described in Gesta Francorum with awe and irritation, was wrapped in two massive rings of fortifications boasting over 100 towers. Modern archaeology confirms 114 towers, walls rising 1,112 meters high and 35 meters thick. This was not a flimsy wooden palisade trembling before divine wrath. This was a fortified jewel of the Byzantine defensive tradition, lovingly strengthened by emperors who clearly had trust issues. And yet the Crusaders tried to batter it down with what can only be described as enthusiasm unburdened by engineering knowledge. Albert of Aachen proudly reports that the armies erected many machinae petrarii and mangonelli, which modern scholars like Michael S. Fulton have politely reclassified as small traction trebuchets, the medieval equivalent of throwing pebbles at a bank vault. These machines could fling stones weighing 312 kilograms, reaching perhaps 820 meters, and achieving a blistering rate of 1 or 2 shots per minute, assuming the operators were sober, motivated, and not currently suffering from the Anatolian heat. To the defenders of Nicaea, watching from their lofty parapets, the entire scene must have looked like amateur hour. Raymond of Aguilers admits with devastating honesty that the walls were so high that the citizens feared nothing from our machines. In diplomatic historian speak, this means the missiles bounced off. John France, in his meticulous Victory in the East, 1994, concludes that no breach whatsoever was created by Crusader artillery, and considering the math, who can blame them? To break walls 5 meters thick, they would have needed counterweight trebuchets capable of throwing 550 kg stones, a technology they would not master for another 150 years. Perhaps the only reliable achievement of their machines was in the realm of psychological warfare. Gesta Francorum recounts that the Crusaders used their trebuchets to hurl severed Turkish heads back into the city. And ironically, as Fulton dryly notes, the light trebuchets they possessed were perfectly suited for objects weighing 35 kilos, that is, the average human head. In short, while utterly useless at destroying walls, their artillery did excel at ruining someone's lunch. Even so, the Crusaders persisted with the grim optimism of men who believed that perseverance could compensate for physics. Guibert of Nogent praises their zealous bombardment, though archaeology confirms that the most they accomplished was chipping decorative masonry. The Frankish knights were determined. The walls of Nicaea were equally determined. The universe, tragically, is indifferent to determination. In the end, the trebuchets had as much influence on the fall of Nicaea as a polite suggestion. The city capitulated not to the Crusader bombardment, but to Byzantine cunning. Emperor Alexios I secretly transported ships across Lake Ascania, cutting the city's supply line. Facing starvation and preferring Byzantine mercy to Frankish enthusiasm, Nicaea negotiated a quiet surrender on 19th of June 1097. The Crusaders woke up to discover that the city had fallen without their machines contributing a single meaningful crack. Thus, Nicaea offers the first and perhaps most embarrassing lesson of the First Crusade siegecraft. Yes, the Crusaders brought trebuchets, but the walls of Nicaea simply refused to care. History, ever the brutal judge, recorded their artillery not as instruments of victory, but as charming early attempts at warfare, somewhere between earnest experimentation and comic relief. If the medieval trebuchet was a graceful engineer's dream, slow, elegant, and almost philosophical in the way it lofted stones across the sky, its Roman predecessor, the Onager, was the complete opposite. Loud, violent, unpredictable, and occasionally more dangerous to its crew than to the enemy. Vegetius, writing in Epitome Rei Militaris, 4-22, explains that the machine earned its name because it kicks like a wild ass. The Romans, it seems, were at least honest enough to admit the first truth about their own invention. It behaved like an enraged animal, and it kicked accordingly. Modern reconstructions confirm Vegetius was not exaggerating for literary flair. During experiments at Salzburg in 1918, Erwin Schramm observed that a medium-sized Onager produced recoil forces exceeding 2.53 kN, enough to crack its own frame or throw the entire machine backward if the crew had misjudged the tension. Roman art likes to depict soldiers operating artillery with stoic dignity. The reality, as Alan Wilkins notes in Roman Imperial Artillery 2024, is that crews typically stood to the side of the machine, well away from the arm's lethal upward swing, because standing behind it was an excellent way to wake up in the afterlife. Yet when the Onager did behave, it was unquestionably formidable. Procopius remarked in Wars, out of 21:17, that its projectiles flew not less than twice the range of a bow shot, a bold claim supported by archaeological finds. At Masada and Qasr Ibrim, catapult stones weighing 7,080 kilos have been recovered. Missiles heavy enough to shatter most ancient fortifications lacking reinforced internal structure. Under ideal conditions, an Onager could reach from 300 meters, placing it among the longest-ranged siege engines of antiquity. But ideal conditions were more myth than reality. Onagers were notoriously fragile. Wooden frames, usually oak or ash, began to warp or split after 1,500–200 shots, forcing legions to carry replacement beams, carpentry tools, and entire kits of spare hardware. Wilkins dryly observes that a Roman artillery train often resembled a mobile woodworking shop more than a siege unit. A well-timed Onager shot could level a tower. A poorly timed one could level its own crew's morale. The machine's raw power, however, inspired the Romans to apply it in ways that were creatively disturbing. Ammianus Marcellinus records in Res Gestae 13:4.4 that during the siege of Amida in 359, Roman troops loaded corpses of the fallen into their onagers and launched them back at the Persian camp. What some might call psychological warfare, others would simply call a legion running out of ideas but not out of torsion power. Either way, it worked. Nothing rattles an enemy quite like having their morning rations interrupted by a flying cadaver. Ironically, much of what medieval and even modern illustrations depict as an onager is based on misreadings of Vegetius. Marsden demonstrated in Ancient Artillery, 1969, that Vegetius's description is a theoretical ideal rather than a depiction of any particular machine. Archaeological remains from Lyon, Gornia, Orshova, and the Spanish finds at Caminreal show wide variation in spring frame construction, arm length, and even mechanical principles, suggesting that Rome operated not a single standardized onager, but a family of related torsion engines. Many modern textbook images, therefore, are little more than well-intended ancient fan fiction. Despite its flaws, the onager remains the most quintessentially Roman weapon ever designed. It embodies every contradiction of the empire: brilliant yet impractical, disciplined yet chaotic, scientifically engineered yet temperamental as a wild beast. It could pulverize enemy walls, defend frontier forts, shatter formations, demoralize opposing armies, and most memorably, nearly decapitate anyone careless enough to stand in the wrong spot. And so the onager endures in history not simply as a siege engine, but as a reminder of Rome's peculiar genius, the ability to build a machine so powerful that even the people using it had to pray it wouldn't turn around and kill them first. If the Roman onager was the drunken uncle of ancient artillery, dangerous mostly to the people operating it, then the trebuchet was the cold, calculating engineer who walks into the same family gathering, says nothing, and simply drops a 100-kilogram stone through the dining table. It did not snap ropes at the wrong time or fling wooden arms into soldiers' teeth. It relied on one thing only: gravity. And gravity, unlike medieval princes, Crusader barons, or Byzantine allies, never betrayed anyone. The traction trebuchets used at Nicaea in 1097 were the humble ancestors of this physics-powered monster. Gesta Francorum proudly records that the Crusaders built machines as soon as they arrived, though the chronicler politely avoids mentioning that these machines were essentially a group workout. Dozens of men pulling ropes in unison, producing enough force to lob a 35 kg stone or, when the mood struck, a severed Turkish head over the city walls. Calculations by modern historians, such as Michael Fulton, show that to throw a human head over a 10-meter wall, the machine needed a release velocity of about 20 ms. Impressive, yes, but Raymond of Aguilez admits that the stones did little damage, which is medieval chronicler code for we hit things, but mostly the things were air. Still, Nicaea was only the opening act. By 1191, during the siege of Acre, the trebuchet had grown up. Itinerarium Peregrinorum describes each army constructing machines with names that sound like professional wrestlers. The Crusaders' God's Machine and Saladin's the Furious One. These beasts hurled 80 and 90 Klinen stones day and night, pounding Acre's walls so relentlessly that eyewitnesses compared the sound to trees snapping in a storm. Archaeological surveys of Acre's fortifications still show the unmistakable circular craters from trebuchet impacts, fossilized reminders that medieval people took rock-throwing very, very seriously. But if Acre was the trebuchet's heavy metal concert, Chateau Gaillard, 1203-1204, was its symphony precise, elegant, and devastating. Richard the Lionheart had built Gaillard and boasted that its walls were so strong even the devil could not take it. God did not comment, but King Philip II of France responded in the universal medieval language of diplomacy, build a trebuchet. William the Breton reports that Philip's machines struck the walls with such force that the stonework quivered like parchment, an image modern archaeologists find surprisingly accurate based on the fractures still visible today. The trebuchets did not merely break the walls, they dictated the tempo of the siege, providing covering fire as sappers moved in, and poetically undid the work of Richard's pride. And then came Warwolf, the trebuchet equivalent of a doomsday device. In 1304, during the siege of Stirling Castle, King Edward I of England constructed what contemporary chronicler Walter of Gisborough described as the greatest engine ever made. Warwolf required weeks of carpentry, hundreds of men, and so much timber that Scotland may be justified in still resenting the English for it. Its counterweight was estimated at 57 tons, launching stones up to 135 kilograms with kinetic energy, surpassing 50,000 joules. When the Scots inside Stirling Castle tried to surrender before the machine fired, Edward refused. One does not spend that much money and manpower to not try the toy out. Warwolf's first shot shattered an entire section of wall. The Scots surrendered again, presumably with slightly louder emphasis. Thus, from the modest traction machines at Nicaea to the physics-defying Warwolf, the trebuchet evolved into the apex predator of pre-gunpowder warfare. It did not need elite craftsmen, saints' relics, or complex torsion springs made of rare sinew. It only needed gravity. And gravity, unlike Crusader supply chains or Byzantine promises, never failed. Across Acre, Gaillard, Stirling, and countless lesser-known sieges, the trebuchet reshaped not only fortresses, but the psychology of medieval power. Where once a stone wall symbolized safety and authority, now a single wooden arm and a heavy box of rocks could erase entire political statements in an afternoon. History, with its characteristic sense of irony, seems to whisper a simple lesson. Whenever humanity discovers a clever new way to throw rocks, someone, somewhere, will use it to destroy a perfectly nice castle.